Alright, what I have here today are the Seekreal Airships, which is Seekreal's first set of IEMs, and I think they did a pretty bang-up job, at least in the music department. We're gonna have time about the gaming department today, so with that being said, let's talk about it. Now, before we get started, I should get some things out of the way. This is going to be more of a gaming-focused review, but we will still touch on audiophile aspects because that'll affect how its gaming performance will be. Now, I should also mention that these were sent out to me for review, but this won't affect my review in any way, shape, or form. Everything you're going to hear here is my own personal opinion. With that being said, let's get started. Starting with the box, despite the IEM model being the airship, those are definitely spaceships, so I'm not sure what went wrong here, but inside the box, you'll get the IEMs, silicone tips, foam tips, extra grills in case you need to replace them. You also get a carrying case, which inside contains the cable, and a bunch of paperwork. Starting with the cable, we get a pretty basic cable, but it's also a very nice cable. It's decently thick and feels fairly durable. It's got a nice all-metal 3.5mm jack with some grooves in the name of Seekreal on it, and for some reason there's some protection, but we're not going to need that here. Further up, we get a pretty simple barrel splitter that's made of metal, and it also has a chin slider. And at the end, of course, are the 2-pin connectors on ear hooks, which is pretty standard these days. Now, the IEMs themselves are fairly small, with this interesting groove design on a very shiny body, which is entirely made of metal. On top are the 2-pin connectors, and as you can see here, the nozzles are entirely made of metal, and in the nozzles, of course, are grills. For those curious, here's how it looks like in my ears, and these are very small IEMs, as you can see here, and I can't imagine anyone having a problem fitting them in your ears. Despite the all-metal build, they aren't too heavy in the ears, as they are very small, and they fit very comfortably because of this, while at the same time not looking very offensively large by sticking out of your ears. So, you know, overall, I do like the fit and the look of these. Though, of course, I should mention that your fit will depend on what ear tips you use, depending on the size and shape of your ear, so your mileage will vary based on this. Alright, now the sound of these guys was, it was pretty interesting. Like, when I was listening to them, it kind of reminded me a little bit of, like, my Moondrop variations, which are, very, very different, actually. They're much more expensive, being, like, almost I think they're 520 bucks compared to these, which are like a little bit under 200 bucks, which is pretty nuts that they still made me think of it a little bit. Sound quality isn't quite the same, so, you know, the variations still are overall much better in terms of, like, the presentation of sound details and quality of that sound, but they still kind of remind me of them, and that kind of led me to be thinking of, like, the sound of these kind of being similar to certain Moondrop IEMs, particularly the Moondrop Kato, in which case I felt that they were very, very similar, only less bright, a little bit more mid-forward, and slightly more neutralish kind of bass, but not too much. Heck, these things are even priced almost very similarly, if not the same, to the Moondrop Katos. So then, like, you know, with that being said, the sound signature of these guys is balanced-ish, where it seemed like the prompt was to make an audiophile product, but still make it, like, consumer sound-ish friendly, while still maintaining an audiophile-esque sound. To be smooth, but analytical at the same time, but not too much of either or. It's a really interesting mix, which I'm sure it'll, you know, some people will like, and some people will not. At the low end, it is balanced-ish, where it's, you know, not too much bass, but enough to be felt. It's got a decent amount of range into that sub-bass region to get a little bit of that grumbliness, but not too much of it. But, you know, there is definitely going to be more of that rumbliness versus punchiness. These things still do have a bit of a punch in the bass, but it's not a very strong punch, because the bass overall in these guys, it's not too much, but it's not too little, where to the point where it's anemic. It is there, it'll still have a punch, it'll still give you that lower oomph, but there's going to be more oomph than there is punch, and there's not going to be a whole lot of it. There's just enough for, like, a lot of people to enjoy it, I would say. I think audiophiles will be quite fine with the bass. I think regular people who like a good amount of bass for a lot of songs and listen to different types of music will be pretty okay with the bass as well. The only people I think who would hate the bass are bass heads who would just want a lot more feel in the bass. But other than that, I do think the bass range is well handled. It is fairly clean, it presents itself well, and it's not overbearing, and, you know, it doesn't bleed into the mids. The mids themselves were kind of interesting. Like, it was kind of forward, but kind of not. It was very detailed at times and had a good amount of clarity. It was articulate. There's a word for this. It was analytical. It has an analytical sound in the mid-range, and this is that's just kind of how it is. But it's also not too analytical, so it tries to be smooth at the same time at times, leaving the mid-range to be kind of interesting. But I did overall enjoy them because there was still a good amount of detail and clarity. It was slightly pressed forward to give it a little bit more presence. Voices were nice to hear on these things. It was good, but you know, it still give you a lot of those details without giving you too much of it, in which case the sound won't be too clinical or sterile. It won't be like you're just looking for sounds to pick at. You can still enjoy the sounds, you know? Because when things get too analytical and lose smoothness and all that stuff, it gets, you know, too into the nitty-gritty of the weeds of the details. Sometimes the sound can be a little bit too I don't know any better descriptions other than clinical and boring, I guess. That being said, these things handle that very well. Like I mentioned, they are, you know, pretty analytical without being, you know, boring. So little bit of smoothness here and there. The highs themselves were also pretty clean, get a good amount of detail, but they did roll off kind of soon. I think they have like a decent reach, but it's not the craziest reach into those upper ranges. It seems to roll off to prevent things from getting too harsh, to prevent sibilance, you know, that ear-piercing sound where it feels like your eardrum is going to tear from the highness. It doesn't get to that point. So if you're very sensitive to really high notes, these things won't reach those points, so you'll be pretty safe. But those who really like brighter sounding IEMs and headphones, you're probably not going to like it very much, because these things don't have like the greatest focus on the highs, so these things played it very safe with that region. It's like I said earlier, it's like they wanted to make an audiophile product, but also wanted to make it consumer friendly so normal people can enjoy it, because some audiophile products sound very boring and anemic. So, you know, I think they did a good job with the sound profile overall. But we didn't get into soundstage imaging yet, because that was what kind of surprised me, considering the fact that these are single driver IEMs. The soundstage for an IEM, mind you, my IEMs have a small soundstage, but with that being said, the soundstage of the airships is fairly large and wide, which is pretty good. It's definitely above average. I enjoyed the sheer width of it. It was surprising considering the size of these guys and the fact they only use one driver each. It was good. It's good soundstage. It's definitely more wide than it is deep. Height is just okay. I haven't found a good set of IEMs that have an incredible amount of height. I think that's just headphones and IEM problems in general. But, you know, there's still a sense of height. Not the craziest amount, though. More of that width than depth, I guess. So definitely ovular soundstage, which, that's pretty normal these days, honestly. But I do wish it was a little bit more spherical so that it would be more useful in a gaming situation. Now, before we get talking about its gaming performance, I should mention imaging, because that's very important for that. The imaging on these guys is just okay. It's like not the greatest in the world. It's not pinpoint accurate, but it is generally accurate enough. It utilizes its fairly wide stage pretty okay, with the sound separation and whatnot being also just kind of okay. I do think it could be a little bit better for more accuracy, but I kind of knew where things generally were when I was using this in games. For music, it was alright. You know, some sounds were kind of close together, and it was a little hard due to the sound separation, but when I put this into a gaming context, it still did a pretty okay job. In competitive shooter games particularly, I think these things do a pretty good job because of the analytical sound, letting you find where these sounds generally are. However, if I'm trying to pinpoint where enemies are, you're going to have a little bit of trouble if you're going to get into like the nitty-gritty of it. But at the same time, I do think in most situations where you're trying to find the general sense of where people are and then switch from audio to visuals, you're going to be okay. Its performance in like competitive to non-competitive gaming reminds me very much of its performance for like music listeners. Make it audiophile, but make sure consumers can enjoy it. Make it pro gaming-ish kind of sound, but not too pro gaming where it is boring, in which case there were sacrifices made for both, you know? So you get a great analytical sound and a pretty good stage to work with, but not the greatest imaging, just good enough imaging where you'll still find people, but not pinpoint people. So, you know, it's interesting how that worked out. That being said, its performance in non-competitive games was pretty good, where, you know, the sound was, it was good, it was enjoyable. You get a really large stage to work with, and it gave you a good size of the area playing these large open world games, or even if you're not playing such open world games, you get a good amount of detail in these worlds to really bring those sounds and help them come to life. I wouldn't say they were the best for non-competitive games. I do think these things are better suited for more competitive games, but overall, in my experience for non-competitive games, you can definitely get through with them and have a really enjoyable time. When it comes to like non-competitive games, it's more about like the funner sounds being better for those games typically. I think if the airships wanted to be really great for non-competitive games, it would just need more oomph in the bass and more punch to really tie it all together for that immersion. But as they are, if these are going to be your only sets, I still think you'd have a pretty good time. Now, who these are for, are definitely for someone who plays more on the competitive side, but not like too crazy competitive. You're not like a super try-hard sweat and winning is the only thing, in which case you'd use something that's more base anemic. These things are for like someone who likes playing those kind of games, and you know, they like playing it a lot, but they don't go into ranked mode or something like that, if that makes sense. But at the same time, when they're done, they'll play with their friends in like less competitive games, or they'll enjoy other more open world kind of games, and still have a pretty good time listening to these while they're playing them. So yeah, with these guys, the concept is basically make them audiophile, but not too audiophile, and make sure it's gonna be able for like to be used by the regular consumers, make it enjoyable. Make them be able to play competitive games very well and find people, but not too good for competitive games where they sound boring and unable to be used for non-competitive games. Overall, I think Seekreal did a really great job with their first set of IEMs, the airships here, and I think the airships are a really great alternative to the Moondrop Katos, in which case, like, you kind of like the Kato sound, but you wish they were less bright and a little bit mid-forward. That's basically all I got for today. If you want to purchase them, I'll link in the description. Probably give me a kickback if you buy them from there, so, you know, helps this channel keep running. That being said, guess I'll see you guys next time.